In a quaint village nestled between the rolling hills and valleys of Mount Kilimanjaro, there lived a man named Thomas. He was a humble farmer who had dedicated his life to the land. Thomas was a deeply religious man who found solace in his faith. Every morning when the sun peeked over the horizon, Thomas would kneel beside his crops and offer a prayer of gratitude and seek God's blessings for bountiful harvest. He believed that his crops would flourish if he had faith in God. One year, however, something unusual happened. The skies turned a sickly shade of gray, and the once lush green landscape became dry and dusty after day. The clouds failed to release their burden of water, and the sun beat down mercilessly on the earth. It was the start of a drought, one that threatened not just Thomas's crops, but the very survival of his family and the entire village. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the parched fields seemed to mock Thomas's efforts. His crops withered and died under the scorching sun, and the once hopeful farmer felt despair creeping into his heart. Each day he watched his neighbors abandon their fields and flee to the neighboring town in search of work and food. But Thomas refused to give up hope. He continued to pray every morning, asking God for help. One night, as Thomas knelt in prayer, a vision filled his mind. He saw rolling hills covered in lush green vegetation. There were meandering streams and a large lake reflecting the sky like a mirror. He heard birds singing, and the air was filled with the sweet fragrance of flowers. He saw himself standing in the middle of it all, surrounded by an abundance of fruits, vegetables, and grains. The vision was so vivid that Thomas could almost feel the cool water on his skin and taste the sweetness of the ripe fruits on his lips. When he woke up from his slumber, the vision still fresh in his mind, Thomas felt a surge of confidence. Despite the drought, he decided to plant seeds and wait for a miracle. His friends and neighbors, who had witnessed the drought's relentless toll on farmers like Thomas, tried to dissuade him. They told him to wait until the rains returned. "Why waste your time and energy? We've all seen what the drought has done to our crops. You should just wait," they said. But Thomas was not deterred. The vision he had received was too powerful to ignore. He remembered the lush fields, the sweet fruits, and the promise of a bountiful harvest. And so he began to prepare his fields. He cleared the land, plowed the soil, and planted various types of crops. As he worked, the villagers gathered around him, their faces a mixture of amusement and pity. They shook their heads and whispered among themselves, "Look at Thomas, the dreamer, he thinks. He can defy the drought with his faith." Thomas felt their stares burning into him, but he ignored them. He continued to plant, hoping against hope that his crops would grow. Days turned into weeks, and still there was no rain. Thomas's crops began to wither and die, just like the other crops in the village. Doubts started to creep into his heart. He began to wonder if his faith had been misplaced. Should he have listened to his friends and waited for the rains? Just when his resolve was at its lowest, Thomas remembered another part of his vision. He had seen not only bountiful crops, but also a large lake filled with water. Could there be a way to bring water to his crops? He didn't know exactly how, but he was determined to try. Thomas set aside some of his crops and started digging. He dug deep into the ground, hoping to find water. The villagers watched him, some with amusement, others with pity. They thought he had completely lost his mind. "What is he doing now?" they asked. Thomas didn't answer. He was too focused on his task. For weeks, he dug and dug until his hands were raw and bleeding, but still he did not find water. Discouraged but not defeated, Thomas decided to change his strategy. He started building a dam, hoping to collect rainwater and channel it to his crops. Again, the villagers watched him, shaking their heads and muttering among themselves. "He's become a madman. What else can you expect from someone who believes more in dreams than in reality?" Months passed and the drought continued. Still, Thomas toiled, driven by his faith and the dream of a better future. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the rain came. Gentle rain that poured down from the sky and soaked the thirsty earth. It had been months since Thomas planted his crops. Now he stood on his farm, and in a loud voice he prayed. He reminded God of the dream he had some months ago. The sun scorched on his skin till tiny sores emerged and sweat rolled on his face like showers. He looked up at the bright sky, still expecting no change. Suddenly, he noticed a dark cloud forming in the distance. At first it was small, but it quickly grew larger, covering the entire sky. He watched in amazement as the clouds gathered overhead, and then it began to rain. Thomas threw his head back and laughed. The rain fell in torrents, washing away the dust and the despair. Thomas stood there, drenched in the rain, his face upturned, his heart filled with gratitude. He thanked God for the miracle he had performed. All of a sudden, amidst the heavy downpour, Thomas noticed something strange. The rain seemed to be coming from one spot above him. As he looked up, he saw a small hole in the clouds. And from that hole, water was pouring down in a thin but steady stream. It wasn't enough to water the whole field, but it was enough to keep his crops alive. And that's all Thomas needed. The rain lasted for hours, and by the end of it, the field was wet and the dam had filled with water. Thomas stood there watching the water flow, his heart filled with joy. He knew that this was just the beginning. With the dam in place and the rain providing a steady supply of water, Thomas's crops began to flourish. They grew tall and strong, their leaves a vibrant green, their branches laden with fruits. The entire field was a sight to behold, a testament to Thomas's faith and perseverance. As the crops grew, so did the hope in the villagers' hearts. They began to see that Thomas's faith was indeed justified. The crops that everyone had given up on were now thriving, offering the promise of a bountiful harvest. Word of Thomas's miraculous harvest spread far and wide, and soon he became known throughout the region as the farmer who defied the drought. People from neighboring villages came to him, seeking his help in reviving their own crops. Thomas, ever the humble servant of God, shared his knowledge and experience with them, and many of these farmers experienced miracles of their own. With the revival of his crops came the return of prosperity to Thomas's life. His family, which had suffered greatly during the drought, was now rejoicing. His children, who had been listless and weak, were now healthy and full of vigor. His wife, who had worried constantly about their future, was now smiling again. Thomas, however, did not forget those who had mocked and ridiculed him during his darkest hours. He reached out to them, offering them a share of his harvest and reminding them that faith could move mountains. Many of the villagers who had scoffed at Thomas's faith were humbled by his generosity and kindness. They realized that it was not ridicule that was called for, but admiration and respect. And so, from being a ridiculed farmer, Thomas became a respected member of his community, a living example of how faith, hope, and perseverance could triumph over adversity. He continued to live his life guided by his faith in God, always ready to lend a helping hand to those in need.